We are live on YouTube. All right, so good morning. It is April 6th, 2020. The quarantine continues. Dun, dun, dun. All right, so what I want to talk about today is this idea of what I refer to as the universal human motive and how that ties into life under normal circumstances and also life during sort of this time of destabilization that we're experiencing right now, and give you some ideas about how I'm dealing with that, what I'm doing to approach all of that, and go from there. So that's the idea. I'm going to attempt to pay attention to the chat window a little bit better than I was last time. It's me by myself, so sorry if I'm not doing great with the chat. I'm going to try to. So with that said, let's get going. So I define the universal human motive as this. The universal human motive is to thrive as an agent in the world. That's a very straightforward, simple statement in my mind, but it is made up of a couple of important points, and I want to break those points down and where I get those ideas from. So let's start with pulling from John Boyd's work from Destruction and Creation. In Destruction and Creation, Boyd says that studies of human behavior reveal that the actions we undertake as individuals are closely related to survival, and more importantly, survival on our own terms. So my notion, my idea about this universal human motive is absolutely rooted in this statement from Boyd in Destruction and Creation. However, it is not just, the universal human motive is not just survival on our own terms in my mind, it's also thriving. And in that way, I'm pulling in information from Abraham Maslow. Any of us who have sat through a business principles class, a management class, a human psychology class, have probably been exposed to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the model that you see on the screen is rooted in Maslow's updated version of his hierarchy of needs. The one that comes from I think it's A Further Understanding of Human Motivation is the book. It's in my basement someplace right now. But so Maslow originally postulates this idea of the hierarchy of needs, and we deal with the physiological needs, safety needs, esteem needs, things like that. And he originally caps that model, the initial 1943 version caps that model with the idea of self-actualization, that we are thriving as a self-actualized individual. We have found that thing that is individually uplifting and creating. In the further reaches of human motivation, Maslow expands upon this idea and realizes that it's not just self-actualization. There's more than just that to it, and that there are other needs that he hadn't addressed. And that's where we get this model that you see on the screen right now, right? We have what is sometimes referred to as the deficiency needs, those needs that are fundamental and required, right? Physiological needs, safety needs, belonging and self-esteem needs as foundational to human well-being. From there, once sort of those foundational aspects are in place, then Maslow's idea is that we now have these things that help us grow and flourish as individuals. Our cognitive needs, our aesthetic needs, which lead to our ability to be self-actualized and eventually engage in transcendent behaviors. In my reading of Maslow, in my interpretation of Maslow, I do not see self-actualization or transcendence as things that are permanent states of affairs. They are, by their very nature, transitory, but they are things that we are constantly building to. So, with this in mind, with this foundation that we are all trying to achieve our aims, right? That we are trying to thrive and flourish in the world, we then get into a little bit more modern interpretation of what that means and that idea of being agents in the world. That comes from Albert Bandura's work. In this case, the way I am using the language comes from Bandura. And Bandura offers this quote in one of his articles: to be an agent is to influence intentionally one's functioning and life circumstances, right? So agency is deeply rooted in human flourishing. It is deeply rooted in a humanistic psychology view. It's also rooted in sort of the, or I shouldn't say rooted in, but tied to the outgrowth of humanistic psychology as it applies to things like self-determination theory from Ryan and Deci, and some of these other notions that are coming along. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, I think I pronounced that right. His book Flow is a really good example of tying these ideas together as well, and how self-actualization and transcendence can occur, and how our lives are fulfilled by those. And so these ideas all come together in my mind to help us see this universal human motive, right? The universal human motive is to thrive as an agent in the world. Now, how do we do that? I think there are a few things that we can boil it down to, and there's certainly a few things that I look at in particular when I try to think about human thriving, right? So the first is, hearkening back to Maslow's model, is that we have to have certain foundational needs met. The way I build that model out, and some of you have seen it in my writing and other ways I've expressed it, is what I refer to as a humanistic needs approach. And I acknowledge that we have these sort of baseline foundational needs, but I also refer to them as acute needs. I think that there are certain acute needs that have to be met, and those are 100% non-negotiable. So we have certain physiological and safety needs that take primacy over everything. Those are the needs that trigger our fight or flight responses in a very acute way. If, may I have a cup of coffee? If you're being shot at, you are very unlikely to be engaging in any sort of aesthetic process. If you are literally starving, you are very unlikely to attain a cognitive need in the moment, right? Those acute needs, access to air, first and foremost, right? If you can't breathe, you got 4 minutes, it's all over, right? If I can breathe, now I need warmth. If I don't have warmth, I am going to expire from the environment and from the elements. It goes on and on. We sort of have a timeline of these things where certain minimums must be met, or nothing else matters. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. Once those acute needs are met, though, then I see those other needs, those safety needs, those belonging needs, those esteem needs, as having sort of relative values in supporting the structure above, which is why we see people from different cultures and different times able to engage in what can only be described as thriving behavior, even though, from our particular viewpoint, they may be seriously lacking in certain foundational aspects in the way Maslow's pyramid is described. So, all of that said, what does it take to thrive as an agent in the world? We need to have a basic level of security. We need to not be experiencing acute fear, right? Acute fear increases our sympathetic nervous system primacy. It is going to cause us to focus on those things that we are fearing. So we have to have those baseline sort of acute needs met. We also have to have some very concrete in the moment needs met. Once those basic needs are met, now is when we are able to focus on what do we want to do. Coming back to Boyd, coming back to Bandura, what are those self-directed, self-selected aims that we want to attain? and how do we go about it? Now, this is where this all starts to sort of tie into where we're at right now in the world and where things are at. So I'm going to talk generally first, my sort of ideas about humans in general right now, and then I'm going to tie it to myself and sort of how I'm dealing with things, and then we'll go from there. So generally speaking at sort of a species human level as best we can, first and foremost, I think that we need to use times of instability and uncertainty like this to detach ourselves emotionally from that fear response. When I say detach, I don't mean ignore. I don't mean denigrate. We shouldn't look at fear as something to be despised, quashed, repressed. Fear is telling us something. That barking puppy dog of fear is alerting us that there is something in the environment that we need to be aware of. The puppy brain, that mammalian brain, may or may not be able to accurately assess the severity or the acuteness of that threat, but it is still telling us something really, really important. So we need to pay attention to it. We need to thank it for its presence, right? In the same way that if you're trying to train a dog to alert but not overreact, you need to demonstrate that what it is feeling, what it is experiencing is important and useful, but it does not have to be the only thing that we engage with. We can also engage with the thinking, the critical thinking, the analytic, that neocortical mind, and use these two things together. If we try and use them separate, if we try and put up a wall between them, we are always going to be at a disadvantage. We need to use all of our brain, the mammalian part of our brain and the more human part of our brain, the more evolved part of our brain, together, right? So the lizard brain, the mammalian brain, the human brain, those three sort of basic levels have to integrate. And we have to acknowledge that each of them has its own priority, but that those priorities can be worked with together, right? So the first thing is acknowledging the uncertainty, acknowledging the fear, accepting it, embracing that it is telling you something, while also giving it a sense of comfort and well-being that the thinking mind also has a plan and can help with these things, that we can help satisfy those fears. So that's sort of the 60,000 foot view of this, is that we need to take stock. We need to detach from the emotion enough that we allow the thinking mind to support and help the emotional mind. And those two things work forward together. With that, then, we continue to move forward and iterate through what is happening in the environment. If you look back to some of the OODA loop videos earlier on, both in the live streams and some of the stuff that I've posted under the Boyd Book Club stuff, we talk about going through that loop, going through that iterative process of observing, our observations being shaped by our orientation also shaping how we observe things, being aware of that orientation, and then making decisions, both through a hypothetical process, a wargaming process, and through an active process, a conscious process of decision making, doing those things, and then engaging by making a decision, acting in the world, and then seeing how those actions unfold. That iterative process is happening whether we are aware of it or not. We may as well be aware of it and use it to our advantage. So, how does that look for me? I've told you version 2.0 of 2020 for me is a very different landscape than how 2020 was intended to go, right? I've seen the meme, I like it, that, you know, if I had the option, I would have returned 2020 as it goes after the 90-day trial period, because it's been kind of screwed up. But that's that's not an option. We keep iterating, we keep moving forward. So how am I iterating and moving forward? How am I embracing and accepting the lizard brain, the mammalian brain, and integrating that with the cognitive, analytical, decision-making brain? Well, decision-making is probably a bad statement, because we do make decisions with those other sort of more primal structures. So let's just go with analytic, right? So how do I integrate the thinking brain with the emotional experiential brain? For me, that looks like, okay, member retention of the gym very seriously compromised by the ongoing COVID crisis. The opportunity to recruit new members to the gym, I have to assume, utterly nuked by what is happening with the economy and going to happen with the economy. We are not just in a health crisis, we are also facing an impending economic crisis that, in my opinion, is at minimum on par with the experience that we had in 2008, 2009 with the housing crisis. I actually think it's going to be much more significant. I think the economic contraction that we're going to deal with is going to be much more in line with what we saw in the Great Depression. How it manifests, I think, is going to be very different. But as far as a small business owner running a boutique gym, I think that the available liquid expendable cash that people have for that kind of service is going to be reduced. And with that, the opportunity to maintain my business as it was structured, poof, disappears. All right, well, initially, there is absolutely an emotional reaction, right? There is a fear reaction, there is a stress reaction, however you want to phrase that, that says, first and foremost, oh my God, how do I deal with this? How do I deal with this threat? And then there is the, what does this say about me? This situation is pretty easy to say, well, this doesn't, for me, it's pretty easy to say, well, this doesn't say anything about me. This is absolutely the environment that's unfolding, and I can set aside sort of the any sense that this is about my worth or my social value. I'm fine on that front. That I can disregard, because this is wholly external environmental conditions. But what's the threat? Well, there's an economic threat, right? Businesses incur debt, businesses have expenses. This is part of my lifestyle, and I need to take care of those things. So what do? I begin iterating. I begin thinking through how that emotion is impacting me and what I can do to manage that emotion, right? We restructure. We focus on what we can do. We change things around. All right, current plan, 2020 1.0, nuked, gone, scorched earth. It's not going to happen. So how do we iterate our way out of this? I'm doing things like this, right? I am focusing on ditching much of my in-person coaching for the foreseeable future, because I can't see people in person, right? We are in a position of social distancing. So I'm doing my remote coaching with some clients. I'm looking at adding some remote coaching clients for folks that want that service and have the resources to invest in it. I'm also looking at restructuring my physical space. So I've talked about how I'm collapsing my business back to my garage and going through a complete rebuild out on the interior of that space, so that I'm able to use it for the video production, the producing these live streams, shooting photos, building digestible programs that people can download and have these resources. And then once sort of the cloud lifts and we're able to be in the same place again, then I'll begin engaging with a little bit of personal training here at my location, as well as starting to iterate into going to other people to do in-person training. All ways of negotiating the current environment for me. There's a lot of power, a lot of emotional power in decision making and in seizing on those things that we do have control over. I don't have control over the health crisis of COVID-19 and coronavirus. I do not have direct control over the economic impacts that are going to come from that. What I do have control over is what I'm doing in the moment to iterate my way out of this. And action, considered action, is a way of managing that fear, not repressing it, not ignoring it, not telling yourself on any level that that fear is bad, but rather saying, okay, there is a threat in the environment. I have to do something to change the environment. I'm not going to focus on the things that I cannot change in the environment. I'm going to focus on what I can change in the environment. Obviously, this is deeply rooted in a lot of what the Stoics talk about, right? This is deeply rooted in Epictetus. It's deeply rooted in Marcus Aurelius. Seneca talks about it, sort of the big three that we hear a lot about in modern discussions of Stoicism. They talk about controlling the things that we can, disregarding the things that we can't. Stoicism isn't repression, though, is something that I want to come back to. Thriving as an agent in the world means acknowledging those fears, those anxieties, accepting them, using the knowledge that they can give us, and forging forward with them. So that's how I'm dealing with this universal human motive and the current situation that I'm in, right? I am finding things that will allow me to thrive, things that will allow me to flourish. I am cutting away all that I can that will hold me back. I am accepting those things that are givens that will not just disappear as being things that I have to use self-determined, choice-driven, intentional actions to manage. That's what I'm doing. That's how I'm moving forward with this process. It helps me mentally. It helps me emotionally. It gives me something concrete to work on that is going to help get through this time of uncertainty while not repressing the very real feelings of anxiety, distress, and fear that are perfectly normal in this time. So those are the things that I'm doing and how I'm applying it in my life. I think if you take those ideas, you can sort of deconstruct them, think about them, and put them in play in your own life in some way. That's my hope. So with that said, next week, we are going to pick up sort of these ideas of applying the universal human motive in a time of uncertainty and some very practical, concrete actions that each of us can use as starting points. So I've given sort of this broad general idea. I've given you now some of my particulars. Next week, I want to focus on some very skill-driven things, some very task-driven things that can help. And we're going to tie that directly to examining orientation and examining the OODA loop, tying those things together and how we apply these things. That's it. That's what next week's going to look like. If you have any questions that you want me to try and address in these live streams, you can email me at Actually, we're going to ditch that. We're going to go with a different email address. You can email me at Chris, C-H-R-I-S, at chrisfsw.com. New website's going to be coming up online with that new email address. So Chris at chrisfsw.com with any comments, suggestions, questions that you have. I will try to work through anything that you all have and incorporate it into these live streams or other content that comes out. With that said, I want to take a moment and thank, this will be the last slide from the March patrons, and come next week we will roll out the folks who so far have supported us in April. So thanks to March's patrons, Kevin Richson, Travis, Adam Mares, Chase Morgan, Eddie Crombie, James Klatsky, Justin Ide, Ryan Trader, Brandon Douglas, Brock Clapp, David Hinosa, Eric Chisholm, Timothy Bullard, Zach Riddle, Andrew Murtaugh, Brent Wigand, Chris Bondis, Chuck Hammond, Craig Wall, Elliot Harris, Keel Sampson, Mark Bates, Matthew Spangler, and Steven. So thanks to March's patrons. Next week, we will go ahead and launch out the April patrons. If you would like to support what I'm doing here, patreon.com/ChrisFSW is a way to support what we're doing here and get access to other exclusive content. I'll see you soon. Cheers.